January 1943, Guadalcanal, Henderson Field. Night comes down fast in the tropics, thick, wet, and absolute. The palm line becomes a black wall. The air smells of fuel, rot, and hot metal cooling after another day of sorties. Somewhere beyond the runway, a generator coughs and settles into a steady growl. Inside a sandbagged hut, men lean toward a dim screen. A green sweep rotates. A thin line brightens, fades, brightens again, an echo that shouldn't exist in a world ruled by darkness. Outside, Marines glance up as if the sky might suddenly show its intentions. Then the message runs. Bearings, range, closing speed, not rumor, not instinct, numbers. Across the field, pilots who have learned to hate the night climb into cockpits without seeing an enemy, only trusting a voice and a moving blip. Because over Guadalcanal, the war is about to change from what men can see to what they can detect. By the middle of 1942, the Pacific War had already taught both sides a hard lesson. Distance kills. It kills plans with fuel limits. It kills men with disease. It kills certainty with weather, reefs, and navigation errors measured in minutes that become miles. After Midway in June 1942, Japan was still dangerous, still expanding, still building, still trying to lock the South Pacific into a perimeter that would strangle Australia's connection to the United States. And then came an airstrip, hacked out of jungle on a long, lonely island in the Solomons. Guadalcanal. To the Imperial Japanese Navy, the strip near Lunga Point was a forward threat and a forward promise, an air base that could reach toward the sea lanes and complicate any Allied movement between Hawaii and the South Pacific. To the Americans, it was a red warning light. If that runway became operational under Japanese control, every ship carrying fuel, food, aircraft, and reinforcements would move under a longer shadow. So the United States chose to gamble early. On 7 August 1942, Marines went ashore. The landings began what would be known as Operation Watchtower, an operation that, on paper, was a seizure of an unfinished airfield. In reality, it was a decision to fight an entire campaign around a strip of coral and pierced steel planking. Within days, the airfield had a name, Henderson Field, and the name quickly became a kind of heartbeat. If Henderson lived, the American foothold lived. If Henderson died, everything on the island began to suffocate, first tactically, then strategically, then psychologically. The daylight war around Henderson was loud and brutally honest. Japanese bombers came in from the north, often staged through Rabaul and other bases in the region. American fighters, often short on parts, short on experienced pilots, short on sleep, had to claw for altitude and intercept before bombs could crater the runway. Anti-aircraft guns fired until barrels burned hot. Men learned the sound of engines by habit. They learned to count aircraft by the gaps between the notes. But Guadalcanal's cruelty was not limited to the sky. The jungle was its own enemy system. It bred malaria, dysentery, fungal infections, heat rash that became infection, and exhaustion that turned good decisions into slow ones. Supply lines were fragile. Food often arrived in forms that didn't feel like meals. Water could be life or illness, depending on how it was handled. In foxholes, uniforms stayed wet. Skin never quite dried. Even when there was no contact, bodies were being worn down. And through it all, there was another war, the one that started after sunset. In the Solomons, the night had value. It hid ships. It hid landings. It hid mistakes. It also hid intent. Japanese naval forces used darkness with skill, fast destroyer runs to deliver troops and supplies, movements that Allied air power struggled to punish without daylight. On land and near the airfield, the night became a time when men listened more than they watched. For rustling that wasn't wind, for the clink of equipment, for the sudden hard crack of a rifle. And in the air, the night became its own pattern of pressure. Single aircraft would come in low, often alone, to drop a few bombs and then vanish. Not enough to destroy Henderson outright, but enough to keep the garrison from resting, enough to keep repair crews working, enough to make every man feel that even sleep could be contested. Americans gave these nuisance raiders a nickname, Washing Machine Charlie, a way of laughing at a threat that was grinding their nerves down night after night. The physical damage could be small. The effect was not. Because war is logistics, but it is also tempo. And tempo is partly made from rest. Every time alarms sounded, men ran to positions. Every time engines were heard, gunners braced, pilots scrambled, crews moved in the dark with flashlights covered and voices low. If the raid was real, it was danger. If it was a false alarm, it was still a cost, wasted energy, wasted fuel, wasted sleep, wasted confidence. In the tropics, even standing still in the dark sweats you out. Even waiting drains you. For fighter pilots, the dilemma was sharp. If you don't launch, you risk bombs on the runway. If you do launch too often, you burn fuel and engines in empty sky, at night, with poor visibility, limited navigation aids, and a real possibility of getting lost over black water. You can't keep aircraft circling all night, not here, not with these distances, not with these maintenance conditions, not with malaria chewing through the ranks. So the problem was not simply stop the raids, the problem was time. How do you know the raid is coming early enough to climb, to position, to intercept, before the enemy is already overhead and the bombs are already falling? In 1942 on Guadalcanal, that question wasn't academic. It was survival. And it pushed the Americans toward a new kind of fighting, one where the first shot wasn't fired from a gun, but from a screen, a sweep, and a signal pulled out of the tropical night. The first answer to Guadalcanal's night problem did not come from a new fighter. It came from a warning, not a lookout's shout, not a nervous guess, but an electronic return, faint, imperfect, and priceless. In late August 1942, an American air warning detachment reached Guadalcanal, bringing with it the beginnings of a system the island desperately needed. The equipment was not elegant. It was heavy. It demanded power, calibration, spare parts, and trained hands. And it arrived into a battlefield where mud, salt air, and enemy bombardment punished anything that sat still for too long. But once assembled and operating, early warning radar changed the shape of the night. By early September 1942, a long-range set, commonly identified in Guadalcanal accounts as the SCR-270B, was operating at Henderson Field. Men called it Radar 1. The name sounded simple, almost casual, but what it represented was anything but. For the first time, an incoming raid could be detected before engines were audible overhead. A contact would appear as a mark on a scope. A bearing could be estimated. A range could be tracked. And, most importantly, a controller could begin to build a picture while the enemy was still out over black water. On Guadalcanal, this warning rarely stood alone. The Solomons had another asset: coast watchers, hidden observers on islands and shorelines, often operating under intense danger, reported aircraft and ship movements. Their messages were fragments of reality passed along by radio: a direction, a number, a rough time. Radar and coast watchers together became the island's nervous system. The coast watchers could tell you something is coming. Radar could tell you where it is now and whether it's closing. It was not perfect. In fact, it was often messy. Radar operators dealt with weather returns, with clutter, with equipment that didn't always behave. They worked in heat that warped focus, under threat of shelling, in shifts that blurred day into night. The scope did not show national markings, did not tell you altitude cleanly. It did not reveal whether the enemy was one aircraft or a formation until the plot made it obvious. And even when radar gave the warning, a second problem remained. Because information alone doesn't shoot down aircraft, it has to be translated, fast, into action. This is where Guadalcanal began to improvise, something that would become standard later in the war: fighter direction under combat conditions. On 20th September 1942, Lieutenant Colonel Walter L.J. Monk Baylor assumed responsibility for fighter direction at Henderson Field. The job was not glamorous. It was a form of controlled chaos. It meant turning imperfect radar plots, fragmentary reports, and unreliable communications into clear instructions for pilots who were climbing into dark air with limited visibility and very little margin for error. A fighter direction center in those conditions wasn't a polished operations room. It was men bent over plotting boards, pencils moving, grease markers, voices tight with urgency. It was headsets pressed hard to ears to cut through static. It was the constant translation of angles and distances into words a pilot could use in the cockpit. Vector left, steady, climb, turn now, hold, target closing. When it worked, it produced something precious, position. Pilots could be launched at the right time instead of wasting fuel in blind patrols. They could climb earlier, so they weren't forced into desperate last-second climbs under enemy approach. Anti-aircraft crews could be better prepared, not surprised. Repair crews could be warned to take cover. Even a few minutes' notice reduced the sense of helplessness that harassment raids depended on. But radar did not give the Americans the night for free. The early warning set could tell you a raid was inbound, but intercepting at night was still brutally difficult. Visual acquisition was unreliable. Moonlight could help, but it also exposed. Clouds could hide the enemy and the defender alike. Pilots could become disoriented over featureless water. Radios failed, engines failed. Friend and foe could be confused in the blackness. And Japanese crews did not simply fly straight into a trap. They varied routes. They used weather. They came in low. They came in alone. They came in ways designed to keep defenders guessing and tired. The nuisance raids continued, and the larger night strikes still found opportunities. So by late 1942 and into 1943, Guadalcanal held a paradox. The Americans were beginning to see the night coming, but they still couldn't always touch it. To truly fight after sunset, warning wasn't enough. The final miles of the hunt, those last few thousand yards where a pilot had to find an aircraft in darkness, still belonged to the attacker. And that is where the story tightens, because the next step was inevitable. If radar could guide fighters from the ground, then sooner or later, radar would have to climb into the air with them, so that the darkness itself could be searched, not just predicted. On Guadalcanal, fatigue was not a side effect, it was a weapon. Days were loud, air raids, repairs, heat, and the constant effort to keep Henderson Field operational. But nights were worse, in a quieter way, because they stole what the body needed most: uninterrupted rest. A nuisance bomber didn't need to hit the runway to do damage. It only had to force alarms, to make men move, to make them listen, to make them wonder if the next sound would be a bomb, a shell, or nothing at all. The Americans called the nightly harasser Washing Machine Charlie, a nickname that tried to shrink fear into something almost ridiculous. But the humor didn't change the pattern. A lone aircraft droning overhead, dropping a few bombs, then disappearing into the dark. One aircraft could disrupt thousands of men. One engine note could set an entire base on edge. This kind of pressure changes a place. It sharpens tempers, it shortens patience, it makes mistakes more likely. On the runway, in the gun pits, in the sick tent, it turns every quiet moment into suspicion, because quiet is never promised to last. And in that environment, technology wasn't just about destroying the enemy. It was about returning something basic to the defenders, the ability to know whether the night was empty or not, because not knowing was exhausting in a way combat sometimes isn't. That human need, certainty, even imperfect certainty, became one of radar's first victories on Guadalcanal. And once men began to trust the warning, the next question was brutal and simple. If we can hear the enemy coming early, can we finally catch him? In daylight, a fighter pilot can use the horizon, a glint, a shadow, a formation shape that breaks the sky's smoothness. At night, the sky is a blank page, so interception becomes math. It begins with time, the enemy's speed, your own climb rate, the distance from the field to the likely track. The moment you launch determines everything else, because fuel is finite, and altitude takes minutes you can't rush. Early warning radar's greatest tactical gift was not seeing aircraft like a camera. It was giving defenders a head start. If a radar set detects an inbound contact far enough out, fighters can launch and climb without panic. They can arrive above the target track instead of below it. They can be vectored into the right patch of sky, reducing the search area from the night to a narrow corridor of possibility. That changes the odds. It reduces wasted sorties. It protects engines and airframes. It makes anti-aircraft fire more disciplined because crews know when to expect the raid. And for the Japanese, it changes the emotional texture of their mission too. Surprise is confidence. Surprise is speed. Surprise is control. If the enemy is already climbing before you cross the coast, you feel it, even if you can't see him. But here's the tactical limit that Guadalcanal exposes. Early warning creates an appointment. It tells both sides that a meeting is coming. What it doesn't do, yet, is guarantee that the fighter can actually find the bomber when the appointment arrives. Which means the geometry is incomplete until the last step, contact. Guadalcanal's radar did not win battles alone. It needed a brain. That brain was the fighter direction system. People, procedures, radios, and discipline, all assembled under the pressure of incoming raids and constant uncertainty. Under Lieutenant Colonel Baylor's direction, the Americans began refining a chain that looked simple on paper and was painfully difficult in practice. Detection, plot, decision, vector, intercept. Detection came from radar and coast watchers. Plotting turned returns into a moving picture. Decision meant choosing whether to launch, because every scramble cost fuel, fatigue, and risk. Vectoring meant translating a plotting board into cockpit language. Headings, turns, climbs, and timing. This kind of fighting required trust. The man on the ground had to trust what the screen showed. The pilot had to trust the voice on the radio. And both had to trust the system enough to keep using it even when it failed. Because it would fail, sometimes, under the pressure of weather, interference, and human error. But when it worked, it created something new, a weapon made of information. Not a single gun, not a single bomb, a network. And networks don't feel dramatic in the moment. They feel like routine, like procedure, like men doing their jobs, until the night comes and a contact appears on the scope, and suddenly you realize the system can reach out into darkness and pull an enemy aircraft toward a place where it can be destroyed. Yet for all this progress, one final gap remained, and it was measured in the last few miles of night sky, where the pilot still hunted, mostly blind, because the next phase of the Guadalcanal story isn't just about warning, it's about finding. Ground radar could warn Henderson Field. It could even guide fighters close, but it couldn't do the last thing a night interception demands: put the enemy inside a pilot's sight in a sky that refuses to show shapes. That final step required radar to move from hut to cockpit. In early 1943, the Americans began bringing a new tool into the Solomons: airborne interception radar, sets designed to let a fighter detect another aircraft ahead, in darkness, by measuring returns from its own transmitted pulse. One such set was the SCR 540, installed in American night fighter aircraft operating in the theater. The idea was simple in principle and brutal in practice. An aircraft is a vibrating platform. Its engine creates electrical noise. Its structure reflects signals unpredictably. Its cockpit is cramped and already overloaded with instruments. Early airborne radar was heavy, power-hungry, and demanding. It required additional crew, training, and maintenance. It didn't turn night into daylight. It turned night into a narrow, tense tunnel of range and bearing information. The operator had to interpret the scope. The pilot had to fly a closing path based on that interpretation. The two had to work as a single unit, with trust and timing, while fuel ticked down and the black ocean waited below. Yet that narrow tunnel was revolutionary. It meant the fighter no longer relied entirely on luck, moonlight, silhouette, or accidental proximity to get within firing range. It meant the last miles of the hunt became measurable, trackable, repeatable. For the first time, a pilot could pursue an enemy aircraft even when the sky offered no help at all. And that technological shift carried a psychological weight that is hard to overstate. It suggested the night itself was becoming searchable. The Japanese did not lack courage in the air over Guadalcanal. They did not lack skill. Their crews flew long distances, often over water and weather, toward an island defended by fighters and anti-aircraft guns. At night, they depended on darkness to protect the approach and to confuse interception. For months, that assumption held. The Americans could hear engines overhead and react too late. They could fire anti-aircraft into a general patch of sky. They could scramble fighters that rarely found a target before fuel forced a return. So the Japanese developed habits, routes, altitudes, timing that worked. Harassment raids worked not because they were decisive, but because they were repeatable. They exploited the same gap over and over. The defenders couldn't reliably connect warning to contact. Radar begins to break that. First, it breaks the surprise. An incoming raid is no longer a sudden presence. It's a plot on a scope, a line moving toward the field. That alone changes how you fly because you know the enemy is already awake. Then, when radar moves into the air, it threatens something deeper. The idea that darkness guarantees anonymity. A night raider expects invisibility. Radar promises pursuit. Stunned doesn't mean shocked like a movie scene. It means operationally disrupted, forced to adapt, forced to accept that a reliable tactic is becoming less reliable. It means the realization that the enemy is beginning to fight with a new sense. Not eyesight, but detection. And once a side realizes its advantage is eroding, the war becomes a race. Who can adapt faster? Who can build doctrine faster? Who can absorb losses and still keep flying into the night? Radar didn't change human nature. It changed the clock. Before radar, a raid might be discovered by sound, sight, or late reports. Reaction time was short and uncertain. Decisions were made in a blur, often too late for the perfect response, often in time only for damage control. With radar, time compresses into measured segments. A contact appears at range. A track is established. A decision must be made, scramble or hold. This shifts pressure upward, from the pilot in the cockpit to the commander and controller on the ground. A wrong decision wastes fuel and aircraft or leaves the field exposed. A late decision collapses the advantage radar provides. A cautious decision can be punished by bombs. A reckless decision can be punished by accidents in the dark. War always involves chance, but radar reduces some forms of chance and amplifies others. It makes the contest more technical, more procedural, and in some ways more relentless, because once you have warning, you can't pretend you didn't know. You are responsible for what the scope shows, even if the system is imperfect. That responsibility weighs on men who are already exhausted, already sick, already stretched thin by the island's demands. And it leads directly into the turning point of this story, because by 1943, Guadalcanal is no longer just a place where raids happen. It becomes a place where the Americans attempt something new and specific, to hunt the night raiders, not with luck, but with radar-guided night fighters. By early 1943, Guadalcanal had been fought into a kind of hard stability. The Americans had held, the Japanese had bled, the jungle had taken its share from both. The campaign's broader end was already forming. Japanese forces would complete their evacuation by early February 1943, bringing the long ground struggle to a close. But air war and sea war habits do not stop on the date a campaign ends. In the Solomons, the night remained a route and a weapon, and aircraft still crossed the darkness toward targets that mattered. Henderson Field still mattered. And so did the larger idea behind it, that Allied air power could sit forward in the Solomons and reach out. That meant the Americans could not afford to treat night raids as background noise. They were still dangerous. They still threatened aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. They still cratered surfaces, destroyed fuel and supplies, and, maybe most importantly, kept men from sleeping like human beings. The question became sharper now, because the Americans finally had pieces that could fit together. They had ground radar warning, they had fighter direction experience, they had Coast Watcher reports. And now, in 1943, they began deploying aircraft designed, at least in concept, for night interception. One of those aircraft was the P-70. It wasn't a clean-sheet night fighter built from scratch. It was a conversion, an American attempt to turn an existing airframe into a night-hunting tool by adding radar and adapting tactics. In the Pacific, it arrived not as a guarantee of dominance, but as an experiment sent into one of the harshest test environments imaginable. On 28 February 1943, P-70 Detachment B began operating from Guadalcanal. On paper, that sentence is tidy. On the island, nothing was tidy. Operating from Guadalcanal meant living with the same grinding constraints as everyone else, maintenance under salt air and tropical rain, limited spare parts, rough living conditions, constant fatigue. It also meant introducing a complex system, the airborne radar set, into a place where everything vibrated, corroded, and wore out faster than planners wanted to admit. The first challenge was always integration. A night fighter was not simply a plane with a gun, it was a plane with a radar set, a trained operator, radio coordination, and a doctrine that had to be invented while the enemy kept flying. The ground system could detect a raid and vector a fighter toward the general track, but the handoff between ground control and the aircraft's onboard radar had to be clean. The fighter had to arrive close enough, at the right altitude and angle, to allow the radar operator to pick up the target, and then the crew had to close that distance without losing the contact. Any weakness in that chain broke the hunt. Static on the radio could erase the vector. Cloud layers could ruin a visual confirmation. A misread scope could send the fighter into empty sky. A fuel miscalculation could force a return minutes before contact. And night fighting punished errors in a special way, because the penalty was often not mission failed. The penalty could be missing aircraft. A fighter lost over black water didn't announce itself with a visible crash. It simply vanished. It became an absence at roll call, a name that didn't come back with the others at dawn. So crews did not treat the mission casually. They treated it with the kind of quiet tension that forms when you are asked to do something new, at the edge of the possible, in a place where the consequences are permanent. Meanwhile, the Japanese were not obliged to cooperate with American learning curves. Their night flights continued to exploit what had worked before. They still had routes. They still had habits of approaching at times that punished defenders' stamina. They still could use weather and darkness as camouflage. And even if the ground radar warned Henderson, warning alone did not guarantee a kill. So early 1943 becomes a hinge, a period of trial, adjustment, and pressure, where the Americans are close to doing something decisive, but not yet reliably able to do it. This is the moment the story leans forward, because for radar to matter at the level Guadalcanal needed, it had to produce more than early warning. It had to produce a result that both sides could feel, something that would announce without words that night was no longer a safe corridor. And that announcement would come on a specific date in a specific kind of darkness, when the radar contact held steady, the vectors tightened, and the night fighter closed in until the enemy aircraft was no longer a sound in the distance, but a target inside the kill zone. Night over Guadalcanal is not cinematic in the way people imagine from a distance. It isn't a clean, blue-black sky with stars and a bright moon. More often it is cloud, it is haze, it is heat that doesn't leave when the sun goes down. The air is thick enough to feel like it resists the lungs. Along the perimeter, men listen for engines the way sailors listen for surf, because sound is often the first warning that matters to the body. But by 1943, the island has learned a different way to listen, not with ears, with electronics. In the fighter direction center, a scope glows. A sweeping line rotates again and again, measuring the invisible with repetition. The operators are no longer treating it like a novelty. They treat it like a tool that must be trusted, because there is no alternative that works better. Contacts are plotted, bearings are called. The moving mark is given meaning, closing, steady, inbound. And once the picture builds, the next step is immediate. Aircraft are ordered up, not as a blind hope, but as a timed response. At Henderson Field, engines start in the dark. The sound is physical, metallic, urgent, shaking the airfield into motion. Ground crews move with practiced speed, faces barely visible, hands knowing where to go by memory. The runway lights are limited, controlled, kept from becoming a beacon. The night fighter rolls, accelerates, lifts off into black air. In the cockpit, the pilot cannot see the enemy, not yet. The sky's a void, but there is a voice in the headset, ground control, translating the plotted track into headings and turns. It isn't poetry, it's geometry. It's a narrow set of instructions meant to put an aircraft into the same space as another aircraft moving through darkness. The fighter climbs. The island drops away beneath. The ocean becomes nothing but absence. Then comes the handoff. Because this is the leap Guadalcanal has been trying to make, from ground warning to airborne pursuit. The P-70's radar SCR-540 is not a magical eye. It is a fragile advantage, a narrow beam of certainty. The operator watches his scope and works to pick up the target as a usable return. At first, there may be nothing, just noise, just the uneven texture of the night. Then, a trace, faint but consistent, a return that holds when the sweep comes back again. A contact that doesn't behave like weather. Now the enemy is no longer just inbound. Now he is trackable. Range is called. Bearing is adjusted. The pilot turns, corrects, steadies. The crew closes the distance not by seeing, but by flying the numbers down, mile by mile, second by second, until the radar indicates the target is within the envelope, where a visual acquisition becomes possible. This is where night fighting becomes intimate. Not close like a knife fight, but close like stalking. Slow, precise, and tense. Every correction matters. Too much closure speed, and you overshoot into nothing. Too little, and the target slips away. If the bomber changes course, the trace shifts. If clouds intervene, the visual pickup may never come. If the enemy descends or climbs unexpectedly, the geometry breaks. Yet on 19th of April 1943, over Guadalcanal, the system produces what it was built to produce. A radar-directed interception results in a confirmed kill, credited as the first confirmed radar-directed night victory at Guadalcanal, with the P-70's airborne radar as the critical tool in bringing the fighter onto its target. In the dark, the actual firing window is brief. At night, you do not get long tracking shots. You get a moment when the enemy aircraft becomes a shape, maybe a darker patch against darker sky, maybe a silhouette when it crosses a thinner cloud layer, maybe an instant when exhaust glare gives away the machine. In that moment, the pilot does what pilots have always done. He closes, he steadies, he fires. And then, almost immediately, the visual cue changes. The enemy is no longer a moving shadow. It becomes a falling one marked by flame or breakup, an unmistakable collapse of purpose. A machine that came to harass and vanish is now caught and destroyed before it can return to the night that once protected it. For the Americans on Guadalcanal, the significance isn't only the wreckage. It's what the kill proves. It proves that warning can become interception. It proves that the last miles of darkness can be searched. It proves that the night raider's most reliable shield, anonymity, can be penetrated. And for the Japanese, it is the kind of message that doesn't require translation. Something has changed. The night is no longer guaranteed cover. The Americans are not only bracing for attack, they are actively hunting, using instruments that do not care about moonlight or silhouette. Even a single confirmed success forces a reassessment because a tactic built on repetition cannot survive if repetition begins to produce predictable losses. Over Guadalcanal, the war takes a step into the future, a future where the most decisive weapon isn't always the gun or the bomb. Sometimes it's the ability to find the enemy first, and once you can find him at night, the battlefield does not end at sunset. It simply changes its shape. The first confirmed radar-directed night victory over Guadalcanal didn't end the night war in the Solomons, but it changed what both sides believed was possible. Before radar-guided interception, nuisance raiders and night strikes thrived on a simple equation. Darkness plus distance equals safety. Even if the Americans had guns and fighters, the attacker could often count on confusion in the final miles. Count on the defender being late, low, and blind. A single radar-directed kill doesn't rewrite a campaign by itself. What it does is rewrite expectations. For the Americans, it justified the strain of building a system in the worst conditions imaginable. The radar huts, the generators, the constant maintenance, the plotting boards, the long hours of concentration. None of it existed for comfort. It existed to turn warning into action. Now there was proof that the chain could close, and proof changes behavior. It sharpens training. It pushes commanders to refine procedures, not abandon them. It makes the fighter direction center, more than an experiment. It becomes a cornerstone. It also affects morale in a way statistics don't fully capture, because a garrison that believes it can fight the night does not feel the same helplessness as one that can only endure it. For Japanese airmen and planners, the effect is quieter, but just as real. Night harassment was never about single decisive blows. It was about cumulative strain, repeating a low-cost attack, often enough to create constant disruption. That kind of method depends on predictability. If the defender develops a reliable counter, the cost balance shifts. Now the harasser is no longer simply annoying. Now he is at risk. That means adaptation. Routes can be changed, altitudes adjusted, timing altered, but every adaptation carries trade-offs. Fly higher and you may reduce some interception risk, but you change bombing accuracy and aircraft performance. Fly lower and you may reduce radar detection at range, but you expose yourself to other dangers and navigation mistakes. Add more aircraft for mutual support and you increase the footprint on radar. Split into singles and you reduce concentration, but keep the harassment pattern. Radar doesn't erase the enemy's choices. It forces him to pay for them. On the American side, the aftermath also exposed the limitations that the glamour of night fighters can hide. Early airborne radar was not a universal solution. It required skilled crews and careful coordination. It demanded maintenance that was hard to sustain in island conditions. Interceptions still failed. Targets were still lost in cloud. Radio still broke at the worst times. Night flying still killed pilots without the enemy firing a shot, but that too became part of the lesson. Guadalcanal demonstrated that night fighting is not a single invention. It is an ecosystem, equipment, training, doctrine, and discipline, grown under stress until it works often enough to matter. By the time Guadalcanal's ground campaign had reached its conclusion, Japan's evacuation completed in early February 1943, the island had already done something larger than holding a perimeter. It had accelerated a shift in how the United States fought. Guadalcanal was where the Americans learned to operate far forward under pressure. It was where logistics and courage met tropical disease and naval fire. It was where air power became a daily necessity rather than a strategic concept. And it was where radar, still crude, still imperfect, proved it could do more than warn. It could turn the night into a place where the enemy could be found and punished. That realization didn't stay on Guadalcanal. It traveled. Because once a navy, an air force, or an army discovers that the night can be mapped, every future battle begins with a different assumption about what darkness can protect. And that brings us to the broader consequences, how Guadalcanal's radar lessons spread outward through the war, shaping air defense and night interception far beyond the palm lines of Henderson Field. The most important changes after Guadalcanal didn't always look like victories. They looked like routines. A radar detachment learning how to keep equipment alive in salt air. Operators learning the difference between weather noise and aircraft returns. Controllers learning what pilots could realistically do at night and what they couldn't. Pilots learning to trust a voice and an instrument when their eyes offered nothing. That is how doctrine is born, not in a single memo, but in hundreds of small corrections, made under pressure until the system becomes dependable. Guadalcanal's early warning network, radar combined with Coast Watcher, reports and fighter direction became a model the Americans refined across the Pacific. Marine air warning units and the broader U.S. approach to air defense carried forward lessons written on that island: how to sight radar, how to protect generators and spares, how to establish communications discipline, how to integrate warnings into a coordinated response. It also shaped the future of night interception. The P-70 was not the final answer. It was a step. Its operations over Guadalcanal showed what airborne radar could offer and what it still lacked: performance margins, reliability, and a purpose-built airframe designed around the mission rather than adapted to it. That gap pointed toward what would come next in the war: dedicated night fighters and more mature airborne radar systems, improving range displays, tactics, and crew coordination as the technology evolved. The direction was clear. Guadalcanal had proven that a radar-guided intercept was possible under combat conditions in the Pacific. The rest of the war would turn possible into routine. And the effect of routine in war is enormous. Routine creates predictability for your own side: launch times, climb profiles, handoff procedures, radio discipline. It also creates unpredictability for the enemy, because the attacker can no longer rely on darkness as a consistent cover. Night becomes contested airspace, not a free corridor. This shift also changed the emotional environment for everyone living around the airfield. When you can't detect an incoming aircraft, the night feels like an ambush waiting to happen. Men sleep in fragments, they dream in alarms, they wake already tired. When you have radar, the night still carries danger, but it carries structure. There's a sense that the darkness has edges, that it can be watched, that warning can arrive before impact. That does not eliminate fear. It changes its shape. The fear becomes quieter, more concentrated. Instead of waiting for a bomb you never saw coming, you wait for the scope to light up again. You wait for the call. You wait for the moment the plotted line turns inbound. And perhaps the deepest consequence is this. Radar compresses the distance between intention and consequence. A Japanese crew may lift off believing the night will hide them. But with radar, the defender can begin responding while the attacker is still far out over water. The chain of events starts earlier, unfolds faster, and leaves less room for the attacker's plan to remain untouched. In that sense, radar doesn't just defend an airfield. It changes how power moves through the air. Guadalcanal ended as a campaign. Henderson Field survived. The Solomons War moved northward, island by island, base by base. But the crucial thing is that Guadalcanal left behind more than wrecked aircraft and exhausted units. It left behind a new assumption about modern warfare. That information, collected, interpreted, and acted upon, can be as decisive as firepower. And with that assumption in place, the closing reflection becomes unavoidable, because the story isn't only about a radar set and a night fighter. It's about what happens to human beings when the night stops being a refuge and becomes simply another part of the battlefield, measured, watched, and hunted. Guadalcanal is remembered for jungle, ships, and the hard arithmetic of endurance. But at night, on that airfield carved from the tropics, something quieter took shape, something that didn't roar like naval guns or explode like bombs. It hummed, it crackled in headsets. It pulsed across a green screen. Radar didn't make men braver. It didn't make the island less wet, less sick, less exhausting. It didn't stop the fear that arrives when engines sound in the dark. What it did was change the balance between surprise and preparation. For months, darkness had been a shield the Japanese could rely on, not always for destruction, but for disruption. It was a way to keep Henderson Field tired, to keep repair crews working, to keep defenders living in fragments of sleep. Radar began to take that shield apart. Not with drama, but with procedure. A plotted return, a bearing, a decision made in time. And once radar rose into the air with night fighters, the change became permanent in a deeper way. The night stopped being a place where a raider could simply vanish. It became a place where he could be pursued by instruments that did not care about moonlight or silhouette, only range, bearing, and closure. That was the real turning point. Not a single aircraft falling into the sea, but the realization behind it. The battlefield was expanding into realms the human senses could never fully command. War was becoming more technical, more networked, more dependent on detection and coordination, on systems that translated invisible signals into lethal decisions. On Guadalcanal, men still fought with rifles and machine guns. They still died in mud and heat. But above them, the future was already arriving, one sweep of the scope at a time. And in that future, the night would never again belong entirely to anyone.